Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left Monsieur Pierre Aronnax and his companions, they had just completed another underwater excursion from the Nautilus in their diving suits to see the pearl beds of the coast of India and a very special oyster which Captain Nemo, the head of the enigmatic organization that calls the Nautilus its home, has been cultivating and creating a pearl unlike any other. Upon their return to the Nautilus, they encountered a lone pearl diver, a month early for the harvesting season, who was attacked by a large shark. This shark was dispatched by the crew, particularly Ned Land's marvelous harpooning skills, and there was a conversation between the captain and Monsieur Aronnax, our narrator, about why the captain, who hates the lands of men, would help someone from those lands. And we ended on the line, "This Indian professor lives in the land of the oppressed, and to that land I still belong, and shall, till the day I die." A poignant sentiment to end on, and brings us right to where we begin this time, with chapter 28, The Red Sea. During the day of January the 29th, the island of Ceylon disappeared beneath the horizon, and the Nautilus, travelling at a speed of 20 knots, entered the winding channels separating the Maldive and Laccadive islands. It even cruised near Kiltan Island, which is of coral origin, and which was discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499. It is one of the 19 principal islands of the Laccadive archipelago, which is situated between 10 degrees and 14 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, and 69 degrees and 50 degrees 72 minutes east longitude. We had then travelled 16,220 miles, or, in other words, 7,500 leagues from our point of departure in the Sea of Japan. The next day, January the 30th, there was no longer any land in sight when the Nautilus surfaced. It was headed north by northwest, toward the Gulf of Oman, which lies between Arabia and the Indian Peninsula, and through which one enters the Persian Gulf. This was obviously a dead end, without any possible way out. Where was Captain Nemo taking us? I had no idea. But this did not satisfy the Canadian when he asked me where we were going. "Ned, we're going wherever the captain takes it into his head to go." "But he can't go far," replied the Canadian. "There is no other way out of the Persian Gulf, and if we enter it, we'll soon have to come back the way we went." "Then we'll come back, Ned, and if the Nautilus after that wants to visit the Red Sea, the straits of Bab el Mandeb are always there for it to pass through. I don't think I need to tell you, monsieur, replied Ned Land, that the Red Sea is just as much of a dead end as the Persian Gulf. The Suez Canal isn't finished yet, and even if it were, a mysterious boat like ours wouldn't dare travel through it. So that means we won't get back to Europe by means of the Red Sea, either. But I didn't say we were heading for Europe. Where do you suppose we're going, then? My guess is that after visiting the waters of Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will go back to the Indian Ocean, travel either through the Mozambique Channel or off the Mascarene Islands, and then head for the Cape of Good Hope. And what will happen when we get to the Cape of Good Hope? Asked the Canadian stubbornly. We'll enter the Atlantic, which we haven't yet visited. But what's the matter, Ned? Are you getting tired of this undersea voyage? Are you getting bored with the continually varying spectacle of underwater wonders? As for me, I'll be sorry to see the end of a voyage like this, which so few men have had the opportunity to make. But don't you realize, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, that soon it will be 3 months since we became prisoners on board the Nautilus? No, Ned, I don't. And what's more, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to count the days and hours. But when will it all end? When the time has come for it to end. Besides, there's nothing we can do about it, and it's useless even to discuss the matter. If you came to me and said, "Now's our chance to escape," I wouldn't argue with you. But this isn't the case. And to tell you the truth, I don't think Captain Nemo will ever venture into European waters. One can see, by this short dialogue, that I had become a fanatic on the subject of the Nautilus, and had begun to identify with its captain. Ned Land ended the conversation, muttering to himself, "That's all fine and good, but the way I look at it, a man can't live without his freedom." For 4 days, till February the 3rd, the Nautilus visited the Gulf of Oman at various speeds and depths. It seemed to be cruising at random, as if it couldn't decide what route to take. But it never crossed the Tropic of Cancer. As we left the Gulf, we sighted Muscat for a moment, the most important town in this area. I looked admiringly at its strange appearance, its white houses and fortifications contrasting with the black rocks surrounding it. I could make out the round domes of its mosques, the elegant spires of its minarets, and its fresh, green terraces. But I only got a glimpse, for the Nautilus soon dove beneath the dark waters. It then cruised 6 miles off the Arabian coast, near the regions of Mara and Hadramut, with their line of mountains dotted here and there with ancient ruins. On February the 5th, we finally entered the Gulf of Aden, a perfect funnel stuck in the straits of Bab el Mandeb, through which the waters of the Indian Ocean pass into the Red Sea. On February the 6th, the Nautilus was within sight of Aden, perched on its promontory and joined to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, a kind of inaccessible Gibraltar whose fortifications the English rebuilt after capturing it in 1839. I could make out the 8-sided minarets of this town, which, according to the historian Idrisi, used to be one of the richest commercial centres along the entire coast. I was sure that Captain Nemo would now turn back, but I was wrong, and, to my great surprise, he did exactly the opposite. On the next day, February the 7th, we entered the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, whose name in Arabic means the Gate of Tears. They are 20 miles wide and 32 miles long, and it took the Nautilus, travelling at top speed, scarcely an hour to pass through them. But I saw nothing, not even Perim Island, which the British government used to help defend Aden. Too many English or French steamers of the lines going from Suez to Bombay, Calcutta, Melbourne, Reunion, and Mauritius plied this narrow passage for the Nautilus to dare show itself. We therefore cruised underwater. Finally, at noon, we were in the Red Sea. The Red Sea, so famous from biblical times, is hardly ever refreshed by rains, and is replenished by no important rivers. In addition, it is continually drained by a high rate of evaporation, which causes it to lose 5 feet of water a year. A strange gulf, which, if it were closed off like a lake, would probably have dried up completely. Unlike its neighbours, the Caspian and Dead Seas, whose water levels have dropped precisely to the point where their evaporation equals the amount of water entering them. The Red Sea is 1,600 miles long and has an average width of 150 miles. In the days of the Ptolemies and the Roman emperors, it was the great commercial artery of the world. And when the canal is completed, it will once again regain its former importance, which has already been partly restored by the Suez Railway. I did not even try to understand why Captain Nemo had taken us into this gulf, but I approved wholeheartedly of the Nautilus's having entered. It travelled at a slow speed, sometimes on the surface and sometimes under water to avoid ships. I was, therefore, able to observe this sea inside and out. On February the 8th, during the first moments of daylight, we sighted Mocha, a town now in ruins, whose walls would collapse at the mere sound of a cannon, but in which there are still some scattered green date palms. Once upon a time, it was a city of considerable importance, containing 6 public markets, 26 mosques, and its walls, defended by 14 forts, were 2 miles in circumference. Then the Nautilus drew nearer the shores of Africa, where the sea is considerably deeper. There, as the ship travelled through crystal-clear water, we could see through the open panels in the lounge marvellous shrubs of dazzling coral and huge chunks of rock covered with a splendid green fur of seaweed and sea wrack. What an indescribable spectacle, and what a variety of beautiful landscapes at the edge of these reefs and volcanic islands off the coast of Libya. But the Nautilus soon went back to the eastern shores, where we could see these tree-lined formations in all their glory. It was near the coast of Tehama, for there not only did masses of zoophytes flower below the surface, but they also formed picturesque networks to the heights of 60 feet above water level. The latter were more whimsical in shape, but less rich in colour than the former, whose hues were kept vivid by the surrounding water. How many delightful hours I passed looking through the window of the lounge. How many new specimens of underwater flora and fauna I was able to admire beneath the rays of our electric light. I saw mushroom-shaped fungi, slate-coloured sea anemones, among others the Thalassianthius aster, organ-pipe corals shaped like flutes and waiting only to be played by the god Pan. Shells found only in these waters, which were spiral-shaped at the base, and which lay in hollows and the madryopic formations. And finally, thousands of specimens of polypary, which I had not yet seen, the ordinary sponge. The class of Spongiaria, the first within the division of the polyps, is constituted by this curious and useful product. The sponge is not a plant, as some naturalists still claim, but an animal of the lowest order, inferior even to the coral. There can be no doubt about its animal nature, and one cannot even go along with scientists of ancient times who said it was halfway between a plant and an animal. I must say, however, that naturalists do not agree as to the structures of sponges. For some, it is a polypary, and for others, like Milne Edwards, it is in a category all to itself. The class of Spongiaria contains about 300 species. They are found in most seas, and even in certain rivers, in which case they are called fluviatile. But mainly they are found in the Mediterranean, around the Greek islands, and off the coast of Syria, and in the Red Sea. There one encounters the fine sponges, which are worth up to $30 apiece. The blonde Syrian sponges, the hard sponge of Barbary, etc. But since I had no hope of studying these zoophytes in the Mediterranean, I was content to observe them in the Red Sea. I therefore told Conseil to join me, while the Nautilus, at a depth of 25 to 30 feet, cruised slowly past all the beautiful rocks near the eastern coast. There were sponges growing in all sorts of shapes, pediculate, leaf-like, round, and finger-shaped. They well justified the names given them by fishermen, who are better poets than scientists. Basket sponges, chalice sponges, cat's tails, elk horns, lion's feet, peacock's tails, and Neptune's gloves. From their fibrous tissues, impregnated with a semi-fluid gelatinous substance, there escaped a steady stream of water, which, after bringing life-giving matter to each cell, was expelled by a contracting movement. This gelatinous substance disappears after the polyp dies, letting forth ammonia as it rots. Then nothing is left but the horny or soft reddish-brown fibers which make up the household sponge, and which are put to various uses according to their degree of elasticity or permeability. These polypories were stuck to rocks, to the shells of mollusks, and even to the stems of hydrophytes. They decorated every twist and turn of the rocks, some spreading out, some standing up straight, and others hanging like outgrowths of coral. I told Conseil that there were two ways of fishing for sponges, dredging or diving, and that the latter was preferable because it did not harm the fibers of the polypary, thereby reducing its value. The other zoophytes, swarming around the spongiaria, consisted principally of a very elegant kind of jellyfish. Mollusks were represented by a species of squid, which, according to Jorbany, are found only in the Red Sea, and reptiles were represented by the vergata turtles of the genus Colonia, which furnished us with a healthy and excellent food. As for fish, they were numerous and often remarkable. Here are those which the Nautilus's nets most frequently hauled in. Among rays I noticed some oval-shaped, brick-coloured limmae, their bodies covered with a different-sized blue spots, recognizable by their jagged double stingers, silver-backed arnax, whip-tailed stingrays, and 6-foot-long bocats, which looked like huge overcoats flapping about in the water. I also saw aeodons without a single tooth, even though they are a distant relative of the shark. 18-inch-long trunk fishes, whose camel-like hump ends in a bent spine. Phidions, looking like morays with their silver tails. Bluish backs and brown pectoral fins edged in grey. Phyatolae, a species of Stromateidae, striped with narrow gold bands and decked in the colours of the French flag. Blennies 16 inches long. Superb carnaxes, decorated with 7 black cross stripes. Blue and yellow fins, and scales of gold and silver. Centropods, a kind of mullet with a yellow head. Parrotfish, wrasse, triggerfish, gobies, etc., and thousands of other fish I had already seen in other waters. On February the 9th, the Nautilus cruised through the widest part of the Red Sea, lying between Saukin on the west coast and Canfuda on the east coast, a distance of about 190 miles. At noon of that day, after our position had been taken, Captain Nemo came up on the platform. I promised myself not to let him go back down without at least having sounded him out on his plans. He came over as soon as he saw me, graciously offered me a cigar, and said, "Well, Professor, how do you like the Red Sea? Have you seen enough of its wonders? Its fish, zoophytes, sponges, and coral forests? Have you had a look at the towns spread out on its shores?" "Yes, Captain Nemo," I replied, "and the Nautilus is marvelously fit for such a study. What a remarkable boat!" "Yes, monsieur. It is completely invulnerable. It has nothing to fear from the terrible storms, currents, or reefs of the Red Sea. As a matter of fact, I said, the Red Sea is supposed to be one of the worst seas on earth. In ancient times it had a terrible reputation. Terrible, Monsieur Aronnax. Greek and Latin historians have little good to say for it. And Strabo states it is particularly rough when the Estian winds are blowing and during the rainy system. The Arab Idrisi, who refers to it as the Gulf of Kulzum, says that many ships perished on its sandbanks, and that no one dared to sail on it at all at night. He says it is a sea subject to terrible storms, strewn with forbidding islands, and with nothing to offer, either below or above the surface. One finds the same opinion in Arrian, Agatharikides, and Artemidorus. One can easily see, I said, that these historians hadn't sailed in the Nautilus. Yes, replied the captain with a smile, but as far as that is concerned, modern men are no further along than the ancients. It took many centuries to discover the mechanical power of steam. Who knows if we will see a second Nautilus within 100 years? Progress is a slow thing, Monsieur Aronnax. You're right, I replied. Your boat is one or maybe several centuries ahead of its time. What a pity that such a secret should die with its inventor. Captain Nemo did not answer. After several minutes of silence, he said, "We were discussing, I think, what ancient historians said about the dangers of navigation in the Red Sea." "Oh, yes," I replied. "But weren't their fears a bit exaggerated?" "Yes, and no, Monsieur Aronnax," said Captain Nemo, who seemed to know his Red Sea by heart. What is no longer a danger for a modern ship that is well-rigged, solidly built, and in control of its direction thanks to steam power, offered all kinds of perils to olden vessels. You must realize that these first navigators went out in boats made of planks lashed together with palm ropes, corked with ground resin, and coated with dogfish grease. They didn't even have instruments to tell them what direction they were going in, and they navigated by guesswork amid currents they hardly knew. Under such conditions, there were, necessarily, many shipwrecks. But nowadays, steamers plying between Suez and the South Seas have nothing to fear from the fury of this gulf, in spite of the monsoons which blow up from the south. Their captains and passengers no longer make sacrifices to appease the gods before leaving, nor do they dress in garlands and gold headbands to thank the gods upon returning. Yes, I said. Steam navigation seems to have killed the gratitude in sailors' hearts. But, Captain, since you seem to have made a special study of this sea, could you tell me the origin of its name? There are many explanations for it, Monsieur Aronnax. Would you like to know the opinion of a 14th century chronicler? Yes. This writer tries to maintain that it got its name after the passage of the Israelites, when Pharaoh perished in the waters which closed in at Moses' command. As a token of this wonder, when the sea was rent asunder, turning red it then was known, by the colour it had shown. That's very poetic, Captain Nemo, I answered, but it's not a very satisfactory explanation. What is your own opinion? My opinion, Monsieur Aronnax, is that its name is a translation of the Hebrew word edrem, and that the ancients gave it this name because of the peculiar colour of its waters. But until now, at least, I haven't seen anything but clear, colourless water. Undoubtedly, but as you go toward the head of the gulf, you will see this strange phenomenon. I can remember having seen the Bay of Tor completely red, like a lake of blood. Do you attribute this colour to the presence of some microscopic plant? Yes, it's a purple, sticky substance produced by tiny little plants called trichodesmids, of which it takes 40,000 to fill up the space of a square millimetre. Maybe you'll see this phenomenon when we get to Tor. So, this isn't the first time you've taken the Nautilus to the Red Sea. No, monsieur. Then, since a while ago you mentioned the passage of the Israelites and the catastrophe that overtook the Egyptians, I would like to know if, with your submarine, you've been able to discover the site of this great historic event. No, Professor. And there's a good reason why I haven't. Why? Because the place where Moses crossed, with all his people, is so covered with sand that nowadays camels can scarcely even wet their legs there. As you can see, that wouldn't be quite enough water for my Nautilus to float in. And where is this place? I asked. It is situated a little above Suez, within that sound which once formed a deep estuary in the days when the Red Sea stretched into the salt lakes. Now, whether or not this passage was a miracle, it was precisely there that the Israelites crossed to reach the Promised Land, and that Pharaoh's army perished. I therefore think that if archaeologists dug in among these sands, they would find a great quantity of arms and utensils of Egyptian origin. Obviously, I replied, and one can only hope, for the archaeologists' sake, that this work will be done some day, when new towns spring up after the Suez Canal is completed. But speaking of this canal, even when it is finished, it won't be of much use to a ship like the Nautilus. No, but very useful for the rest of the world, said Captain Nemo. People in ancient times understood only too well how important it was for commerce to connect the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. But they did not think of digging a direct canal, and instead did it by way of the Nile. If one can believe traditional accounts, the canal connecting the Nile and the Red Sea was probably begun under Sesostris. In any case, it is certain that in 615 BC, Nekos started work on a canal which was fed by Nile water and crossed the plains of Egypt opposite Arabia. It took 4 days to travel the length of this canal, and it was wide enough for 2 triremes to pass side by side. It was continued by Darius, the son of Hittapsi, and probably finished by Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it used for shipping, but because it sloped gently down from Bubastis to the Red Sea, it was only usable for several months a year. This canal served commerce till the period of the Antonine emperors. It was then abandoned and became sanded over, until it was finally put back into use by the Caliph Omar. But then it was filled in once more, and for all, in 761 or 762, by the Caliph al-Mansur, in order to prevent Muhammad ben Abdallah, who had rebelled against him, from receiving supplies. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, he discovered traces of these canals in the desert near Suez, and while searching for them, he was overtaken by the tide and almost drowned several hours before reaching Hajaroth, where Moses had camped 3,000 years ago. Well, Captain, what the ancients did not undertake, this junction of two seas which will shorten the route from Cadiz to India by 5,600 miles, de Lesseps is now doing, and before long he will have changed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, you have the right to be proud of your compatriot. Such a man honors a country even more than a great sea captain. Like so many others, he at first only encountered difficulties and refusals, but in the end he triumphed, for he has the will of a genius. And it is a sad thought that this work, which should have been done by an international body, and which would have been enough to make one country proud, succeeded thanks to the efforts of a single man. All honor to Monsieur de Lesseps. Yes, all honor to a great man, I answered, completely taken aback by the manner in which Captain Nemo had spoken. Unfortunately, he went on, I shan't be able to take you through the Suez Canal, but you will be able to see the long jetties of Port Said when we arrive in the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow. In the Mediterranean? I cried. Yes, Professor. Does that surprise you? What really surprises me is the thought that we'll be there the day after tomorrow. Really? Yes, Captain, even though scarcely anything surprises me any more aboard your ship. But just what is it that surprises you? The fantastic speed at which the Nautilus will have to travel if it is to be in the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow, after going all the way around Africa by the way of the Cape of Good Hope. But who said we were going around Africa, Professor? Why bring up the Cape of Good Hope? But unless the Nautilus can sail over dry land and cross the isthmus, or under it, Monsieur Aronnax. Under it? Yes, replied Captain Nemo calmly. A long time ago, beneath this strip of land, nature did the same thing man is now doing on the surface. What? There's a passage? Yes, an underground passage, which I have called the Arabian Tunnel. It starts beneath Suez and ends in the Gulf of Pelusium. But the Isthmus of Suez is made of shifting sand. Only to a certain depth. 150 feet down, one meets a layer of solid rock. Did you discover this passage by chance? I asked, more and more surprised. Both by chance and logic, Professor. and more by logic than by chance. I'm listening, Captain, but my ears can scarcely believe what they hear. Ah, monsieur, they have ears, but they hear not, is an eternal truth. Not only does this passage exist, but I have used it several times. If not, I never would have wandered into such a dead end as the Red Sea. Would it be asking too much to know how you discovered this tunnel? Monsieur, answered the captain, there can be no secrets between people who will never part. I paid no attention to this insinuation and awaited Captain Nemo's account. Professor, it was simple naturalist's logic that led me to discover this hitherto unknown passage. I had noticed that the Red Sea and the Mediterranean contained certain identical species of fish, ophidians, fiatolae, girelles, persigae, joels, and exocoeti. Knowing this, I began to wonder if there didn't exist some passage between the two seas. If it did exist, the underground current must necessarily flow from the Red Sea, to the Mediterranean, because of their different levels. I therefore hauled up a number of fish around Suez, slipped a brass ring around their tails, and threw them back into the water. Several months later, off the coast of Syria, I caught several specimens of my fish with their rings. I had, therefore, proved that there existed some passage between the two seas. I looked for it with my Nautilus, found it, and explored it. And very soon now, Professor, you too will have travelled through my Arabian tunnel. Chapter 29. The Arabian Tunnel. That same day, I recounted to Conseil and Ned Land that portion of the conversation which would most interest them. When I said that in 2 days we would be in the Mediterranean, Conseil clapped his hands, but the Canadian only shrugged his shoulders. An underwater tunnel, he cried, connecting the two seas. Whoever heard of such a thing?
Ned, my friend, replied Conseil, who had ever heard of the Nautilus? Nobody, but it existed all the same. So don't shrug your shoulders and try to brush off ideas just by claiming nobody's ever heard of them.
We'll see, retorted Ned Land, shaking his head. But just remember, I'd give anything to be able to believe in this tunnel. And in fact, I pray to God that it does take us into the Mediterranean. That same afternoon, at 21 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude, the Nautilus surfaced and drew near the coast of Arabia. We sighted Jeddah, an important trading center for Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and India. I could clearly make out its houses, the ships moored to its docks, and larger vessels which had to anchor further out. The sun was now quite low on the horizon, and struck full on the houses of the town, bringing out their whiteness. Outside, several wood or reed cabins indicated where the Bedouins lived. Soon Jeddah disappeared in the evening shadows, and the Nautilus once again dove beneath the surface of the somewhat phosphorescent water. On the next day, February the 10th, the Nautilus sighted several ships heading in the opposite direction, and was once more obliged to cruise underwater, but at noon the sea was found to be deserted, and we came back up to take our position. Accompanied by Ned and Conseil, I went up and sat on the platform. The shoreline off to the east could only be seen as a vague blur through the mist. We were leaning on the side of the dinghy and chatting about one thing and another, when Ned Land pointed out to sea and said, "Do you see something over there, Professor?" "No, Ned, but as you well know, my eyes aren't as good as yours." "Take a good look," Ned went on. "There, off the starboard bow. Can't you see something moving?" "Yes," I said, after looking carefully. "I can make out something long and black on the surface." "Another Nautilus?" said Conseil. "No," answered the Canadian. "Unless I'm very mistaken, it's some sea animal." "Are there whales in the Red Sea?" asked Conseil. "Yes, every now and then they're seen here. But it isn't a whale," Ned Land continued, not losing sight of the object. "Whales and I are old friends, and I can tell them by the way they move." "The Nautilus is heading that way," said Conseil, "and in a little while we'll be able to know for sure what it is." And, in fact, this blackish object was soon only a mile away. It looked like a large reef stuck in mid-ocean. What was it? I had no idea. "Look, it's moving, it's diving," cried Ned Land. "What in God's name is it? It hasn't got the forked tail of a whale, and its fins look like sawed-off legs." "That means," I said. "Now it's rolled over on its back," continued the Canadian, "with its mammaries in the air." "It's a mermaid," cried Conseil. "A real mermaid, begging monsieur's pardon." This word, mermaid, put me on the right track, and I realized that this animal belonged to that species from which had sprung the legends about mermaids, creatures which were half woman and half fish. "No," I said to Conseil, "it isn't a mermaid, but a strange animal, of which only a few specimens remain in the Red Sea. It's a dugong." "Oh, order of Sirenia, division of Pisciforma, subclass of Monodelphians, class of mammals, subkingdom of vertebrates," replied Conseil. Once he had stated this, Conseil had nothing more to say. Meanwhile, Ned Land was still watching. His eyes burned with desire at the sight of the animal. He seemed all set to harpoon it, or even throw himself in the water and attack it in its own element. "Ah, monsieur," he said in a trembling voice, "I have never killed that kind of creature." All his harpooner's soul was contained in this one phrase. Just then, Captain Nemo appeared on the platform. He noticed the dugong and realized how the Canadian felt, and said, "If you were holding a harpoon right now, Master Land, I'll bet it would be burning right through your hand." "Oh, it certainly would, Captain." "Would you like to take up your old profession again for one day, and add this creature to the list of fish you've already caught?" "There's nothing I'd like more." "Well then, go ahead and try." "Oh, Captain," replied Ned Land, his eyes aflame. "Only, you must promise not to miss it," the captain went on. "And I say that in your own interest." "Is a dugong dangerous when attacked?" I asked, in spite of the Canadian's shrug. "Yes," the captain replied. "Sometimes it turns on its attackers and capsizes their boat, but with Ned Land there's nothing to fear. His eye is sharp and his arm sure. I only advise him not to lose this dugong, because it is rightly regarded as a fine food fish, and I know that Master Land does not dislike a good meal." "You mean to say," exclaimed the Canadian, "that in addition to everything else, this animal's good to eat?" "Yes, Master Land. Its flesh is like real meat and is held in high esteem. Throughout the East Indies it is reserved for princes. As a result, it's been so relentlessly hunted that, just like its close cousin the manatee, it's becoming rarer and rarer."
"Well then, Captain," said Conseil gravely, "if by chance this one here is the last of his race, wouldn't it be better to spare him in the interests of science?"
"Maybe," retorted the Canadian, "but in the interests of cooking, it would be best to hunt him." "Go ahead then, Master Land," said Captain Nemo. Just then, 7 members of the crew, as mute and impassive as ever, came up on deck. One carried a harpoon and a line of the type used by whalers. The dinghy was uncovered, taken from its niche, and put to sea. 6 oarsmen took their places at the oars, and the coxswain took the tiller. Ned, Conseil, and I got in and sat down in the stern. "Aren't you coming, Captain?" I asked. "No, monsieur, but I wish you luck." The dinghy was shoved off, and propelled by its 6 oars, made rapid headway toward the dugong, which was then floating about 2 miles from the Nautilus. When we got about 500 yards away, the dinghy slowed down, and its oars dipped noiselessly into the silent waters. Ned Land took up his harpoon and went up to stand in the bow of the boat. A whaler's harpoon is usually attached to a very long line, which unwinds rapidly as the wounded animal dives. This line, however, was no longer than 50 or 60 feet, and was attached at the other end to a little barrel which was intended to float and indicate the dugong's position. I stood up and took a close look at the Canadian's adversary. The dugong, which is also called a halicore, is somewhat similar to the manatee. It has an oblong body ending in a long tail, and its side fins are tipped with veritable fingers. It differs from the manatee in that its upper jaw is armed with 2 long and pointed teeth, which stick out on either side. The dugong Ned Land was preparing to attack was enormous. It must have been around 25 feet long. It wasn't moving and seemed asleep on the surface. This would make it easier to capture. The dinghy cautiously approached to within 20 feet of the animal. The oars hung in midair. I rose to a crouching position. Ned Land was leaning back, brandishing the harpoon in his experienced hand. Suddenly, I heard a whistling noise, and the dugong disappeared. The harpoon had been thrown with great force, but it seemed only to have struck water. "Curses!" cried the Canadian in a rage. "I missed it." "No," I said. "You wounded it. See, the blood, over there. But your harpoon didn't stay in its body." "My harpoon! My harpoon!" cried Ned Land. The sailors started rowing again, and the coxswain steered the boat towards the floating barrel. Once the harpoon had been recovered, the dinghy once again set out after the dugong. From time to time, it would come to the surface to breathe. Its wound had not weakened it, for it swam at great speed. The 6 oarsmen pulled with all their strength, and the dinghy flew across the sea in pursuit of the animal. Several times it got to within 20 or 25 feet, but then the dugong would suddenly dive and disappear again. One can imagine Ned Land's anger. He was shouting at the poor creature, which all the worst swear words in the English language would provide. As for me, I was merely disappointed that the animal was able to thwart us at every turn. We chased it without stopping for an hour, and I had begun to think it would be almost impossible to capture it when this animal got the unfortunate idea of getting his revenge. This was to be his downfall. He turned on the dinghy and got ready to attack. This maneuver did not escape the Canadian's attention. "Watch out!" he cried. The coxswain said several words in their strange language, undoubtedly warning the men to be on their guard. The dugong came within 20 feet of the dinghy, stopped and sniffed the air with its huge nostrils. Then it started moving again and rushed headlong in our direction. The dinghy could not avoid the blow. We were almost capsized, and the dinghy shipped a ton or 2 of water which had to be bailed out. We had been saved from actually going over by the coxswain's skill in manoeuvring so that we were struck at an angle and not full on the side. Ned Land was clinging to the bow and harpooning the giant animal again and again as it sunk its teeth into the gunwale and lifted the boat out of the water like a lion attacking a deer. We were thrown on top of one another, and things might have ended badly if the Canadian, carrying on the struggle relentlessly, had not finally struck the animal in the heart. I could hear a grinding of teeth on the iron hull, and then the dugong disappeared, taking the harpoon with it. But soon the barrel came back to the surface, and a little later the animal's body also appeared, floating on its back. The dinghy went over, took it in tow, and headed for the Nautilus. Very powerful pulleys had to be used to haul it up on the platform. It weighed 11,000 pounds. When it was cut up, the Canadian watched every detail of the operation. That same day at supper, the steward served me several slices of this meat, very well prepared by the cook on board. I found it excellent, and even better than veal, to say nothing of beef. On the next day, February the 11th, the ship's galley was enriched by yet another delicate piece of game. A flock of terns had descended on the Nautilus and been caught. They were a species of Sterna nilotica, found only in Egypt, and had a black beak, a grey pointed head, white dots around their eyes, greyish-black wings and tail, white stomach and throat, and red feet. We also captured a few dozen Nile ducks, which make an excellent dish. These birds have white heads and necks, and the rest of their body is covered with black spots. The Nautilus had reduced its speed. It moved as if it were just out for a stroll, so to speak. I observed that the water of the Red Sea became less and less salty as we drew near Suez. Toward 5 in the afternoon, we sighted Cape Ras Mohammed, which forms the tip of Arabia Petraea. that portion of land between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Nautilus then entered Jubal Straits, leading to the Gulf of Suez. I could see clearly a high mountain dominating the land between the two gulfs. It was Mount Horeb, or Sinai, on which Moses saw the God face to face, and which one always imagined sheathed in lightning. The Nautilus continued cruising alternately on the surface and underwater, and at 6 o'clock we passed Tor, situated inside a bay whose waters seemed tinted with red, a phenomenon Captain Nemo had mentioned earlier. Then night came on. In the midst of a heavy silence, broken occasionally by the cry of a pelican, by the crash of surf on rocks, or by the faraway splashing of a steamer as its paddle wheels struck the water with a resounding sound. From 8 to 9 o'clock, the Nautilus cruised only a short distance below the surface. According to my calculations, we were probably very near Suez. Through the panels in the lounge, I could see the rock walls brightly illuminated by our electric light. It seemed as if the gulf were getting narrower and narrower. At 9:15, the boat returned to the surface, and I went up on deck. I was very impatient to go through Captain Nemo's tunnel. I could not sit still, and had come up to take a breath of the fresh night air. Soon I could make out through the darkness a pale light, half discolored by the mist, shining about a mile away. "A floating beacon," someone near me said. I turned around and recognized the captain. "It's the floating beacon of Suez," he went on. "It won't be long now before we're at the mouth of the tunnel." "It must be rather difficult to enter." "Yes, it is. That is why I stay in the helmsman's compartment during the entire operation. And now, if you would kindly go below, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is going to dive, and will not surface again until we have gone through the Arabian Tunnel." I followed Captain Nemo. The hatch closed, the reservoirs filled with water, and the submarine dove to a depth of 30 or 35 feet. "Professor," he said, "would you like to keep me company in the helmsman's compartment?" "I would be very flattered," I answered. "Come then. You will be able to see everything of this trip that will take us both underwater and under land." Captain Nemo led me toward the central companionway. Halfway up, he opened a door, went down the upper gangways, and finally entered the helmsman's compartment, which, as the reader already knows, was situated on the forward part of the platform. It was a cabin about 6 feet square, and more or less resembling the bridges on Mississippi and Hudson steamboats. In the middle was a vertical wheel connected to rudder chains running to the stern of the ship. 4 portholes made of lens-like glass, one in each wall, permitted the helmsman to see in all directions. Once my eyes became accustomed to the darkness in the compartment, I could make out the helmsman, a powerfully built man, gripping the rim of the wheel. Outside, the sea was brilliantly lit by the searchlight behind us at the other end of the platform. "Now," said Captain Nemo, "let's find the tunnel." Electric wires ran between this compartment and the engine room, thus permitting the captain to communicate directly. He pressed a metal button, and immediately the engines slowed down considerably. I looked out in silence at the high, sheer wall, the solid rock base of the sandy mountains on the coast near which we were traveling. We followed it for an hour, only a few feet away. Captain Nemo did not take his eyes off the compass installed inside the cabin. At a mere gesture from him, the helmsman would instantly alter his course. I had taken my place at the port window, and I could make out magnificent coral foundations, zoophytes and seaweed, and from cracks in the rock I could see crustaceans waving their enormous claws. At 10:15, Captain Nemo took the wheel. A large gallery, black and deep, opened up before us. The Nautilus boldly entered it. A strange rumbling could be heard on either side. It was the sound of the water rushing down the sloping tunnel from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. In spite of the fact that the engines had been reversed to counteract the force of this current, the Nautilus shot forward like an arrow. Along the narrow walls of the tunnel, I could make out nothing but brilliant streaks, straight furrows of fire created by our speed and the strong electric light. My heart was beating fast, and I brought my hand to my chest in order to calm it. At 10:35, Captain Nemo left the wheel, turned toward me, and said, "The Mediterranean." The Nautilus had been carried along by the current at such speed that it had crossed the Isthmus of Suez in less than 20 minutes. And that, my friends, is where we will leave our story for today. Finally, the Nautilus has entered the Mediterranean Sea, a place that Ned Land has long hoped they would arrive, for it presents the best opportunities for escape, at least in his view. We'll see what happens in the Med next time on Soft Stories. Thank you all so much for joining me, this time and in future. And thank you also to those of you who have reached out about the stickers that we have. I was so delighted that people were interested in getting themselves a set. We've got two designs. One is the channel logo, classic and designed by Miss Lindsay Little, creator of comics and excellent illustrations. And the other, also designed by Miss Little, is our little mascot and friend, Pepper, who has fallen asleep and is snoring softly behind me. She seems to enjoy these tales. It puts her to sleep, puts her in a nice frame of mind, and I hope it does the same for you. I hope you have enjoyed our reading today, and if you're interested in getting a copy of either of these stickers, I would be delighted to provide them to you. Just get in touch with me either through the comments or by email at softstoriesasmr@gmail.com, and I'm sure we can arrange something. Thank you so much for joining me today. I must leave you now, but until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.